Do you want to stream and are wondering about the FPS impact if you have like an Elgato or a Avermedia capture card? Well, we have some graphs and some performance numbers we're going to go over, so let's jump into it. So what we have here is our system specs. We're using a 9900K, 5 GHz, and an RTX 2060 EVGA, also overclocked. Here are the different specs and system specs. And basically we'll jump right into some numbers. So basically we're running the Division 2 benchmark, which is about an 80-90 second benchmark. And we got, without recording, 95 FPS and 70 FPS 1% lows, and the CPU usage was about 28, and we used hardware info to give an average for that. And basically we're now comparing that to using Shadowplay to stream, and we were streaming at 1080p 60 FPS for the tests at a 6 megabits per second. That's the average, or what they recommend for the different platforms, and we get to see some pretty good numbers. We also did some recording testing just earlier, so we're just going to see a little bit of different numbers here, so pretty interesting. We'll go over that too specifically, but basically we're going to see 86 FPS with Shadowplay, 64 1% lows, and 27% CPU usage. And we also get to compare this to OBS, which got around the same 86. This is now using the CPU to encode and upload for the streaming. So 86 FPS, 64 1% lows, and we see a high CPU usage of 44%. Previously we saw 48%, and that was obviously for recording, and that was a 40,000 bit rate for recording, so it was a little bit larger, a little bit different of a scenario, but we saw a little bit of a difference in CPU usage and FPS, so just wanted to mention that, kind of interesting. And then other OBS modes we used were the hardware encoder, so we got 82 FPS, about a 4 FPS drop here, 3 on the 1% lows. And then for the OBS hardware encoder, this is for the RTX cards. We mentioned that in the other recorded video, some more information on that. We see 83 FPS, 1 FPS gain, and then we get to compare that to OBS NDI streaming. So that is streaming with a second computer through your network. You can just find a YouTube video on that to check that out and to set it up anyways. And we saw an 86 FPS, so you get to see a little bit of a performance improvement by using a second computer, 3 FPS there. And we can now compare OBS to Elgato streaming. So what we're seeing here is around 88 FPS when streaming. Also a little note here, when recording we saw 84 FPS. So we saw a little bit of a 4 FPS boost for streaming, which is kind of interesting. It could again be related to recording a larger file versus streaming a 6 megabits versus recording 40 megabits. It's a little bit different there, so pretty interesting. And so this is pretty much better than all the OBS options, even with a second PC, so kind of interesting there, and good for capture cards in general. And comparing that to the 2PC performance, you'll see 92 FPS if you connect the Elgato to a second computer and use that for any extra, like basically the video profile, the video software you'll see on that computer, and a little bit less of an impact on your main system. And we're getting close to the no recording performance impact, so all these recording methods will give you a little bit of an impact going on to your FPS and game footage, gameplay playback. And then we get to see Elgato versus Avermedia Capture Card. So specifically we're talking about the Elgato HD60 S versus the Avermedia LGP2. This is not the 4K version. So that's the 4K pass-through version. There's a couple other capture cards that have different specs, but basically we see 79 FPS, 56 1% lows, similar to the recording. So we see a pretty big drop here, and then we get to see not too much of a drop compared to the Elgato 88, so about 11 FPS drop. And then Avermedia, a 2 PC setup, we see 92 FPS, similar to the Elgato 2 PC setup, better than the OBS NDI 2 PC setup, so that is good. So for capture cards, and then a 67 1% lows and 29% CPU usage. So those are the pretty interesting numbers for capture cards in general for streaming, specifically at 6 megabits per second, 1080p, 60 FPS. So pretty good streaming numbers. And again, the only real differences between streaming and recording is we see Shadowplay gets a little bit of a drop when streaming, even though it's streaming at a lower lower bit rate. And then we also saw the 44 on the CPU usage jump up to 48 or jump down to 48 for streaming, which is kind of interesting to use 4% less, but again, it's a lower bitrate. And then the third difference was that we saw was 88 FPS on the Elgato versus 84 recording on the Elgato. So 3 different small changes from recording to streaming. It's just something we wanted to mention since we're doing 2 videos on it. So pretty good numbers for capture cards. And we talk a little bit more about system specs in the other recording video. We talk about some of the recording methods for 2 keyframes, and some of the RTX blinks will link in that video. So also we get to see some other little tidbits. We talk about capture cards in that video too, about the 60 Hertz limit. You have to set your monitor to 60 Hertz for these 2 capture cards that are $160. There's other ones that'll do higher frame rate and higher Hertz monitors, but you'll have to look into that a little bit more, a little bit out of the scope of this comparison video. And a couple other things, we kind of do some questions and answers in the for CPU recommendations. If you're looking for a CPU, we talk a little bit more about Intel CPUs in the recorded video, which we'll leave a link to the other video below. But basically, even AMD CPUs from 4 to 8 cores, anywhere in the $200 range, will generally be acceptable for streaming at 1080p or 720 60 FPS is really good. For lower end CPUs, you don't need a 9900K overclock to 5 GHz. You don't technically need a capture card unless you're going for like the best possible streaming setup and best quality for your viewers. So these are definitely benefits you can get for yourself, higher FPS, and for your viewers. So that is pretty good for around $160. And that's pretty much all we have to say about streaming. Here's your performance impact against the recording. And again, quality wise, we didn't compare too much here, but we have a link to all 9 videos, all different recording methods. If you want to compare, we'll leave a link to this playlist if you want to check out the quality difference for each different recording setup, Elgato versus Avermedia versus OBS. Every setting is pretty much default besides the ones we had to change, so OBS had to go to advanced. Again, we talked some more about that, even more in depth in the recorded video. It's a little bit longer. So with that, we have some pretty good streaming results, and we have Mark saying, what, no way 2 shows today? Yeah, recording and streaming are a little bit different. We saw some different numbers, so we put out a second video, people looking for streaming number performance impact and for recording their games. A lot of different ways you can do that. Obviously, as we've shown here, there's a couple more options, different stream capture cards, but these are the most popular in the $160 range. So good options all around, and we'll leave a link to this graph and the other system settings below. So if you want to check out and run some more in-depth reading, there will be that for you. So with that, we will have another episode tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific with some more tech and game news, and we will be signing out. Pew 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 pew.